In the spring of 2020, while the world locked its doors and stared at rising death counts, something far larger than a virus slipped through the cracks of history. $9 trillion vanished from the retirement accounts, small businesses, and life savings of ordinary people across America and Britain, and in the exact same window, the wealth of the planet's billionaires surged by $5 trillion. By the time the masks came off in 2023, the richest 1% had captured more new wealth than at any moment since the Gilded Age, and the bottom 90% were left holding mortgages they could no longer afford, rents that had doubled, and dreams that suddenly felt 2 generations out of reach. This was not an accident of nature. It was not the invisible hand of the market. It was the largest upward transfer of wealth in human history, executed in plain sight while every television screen, every phone notification, every headline screamed only one word: pandemic. Most people remember 2020 as the year the world stopped. But for a small circle of central bankers, hedge fund titans and private equity kings, it was the year the starting gun finally fired. They had spent the previous decade stress-testing the system, running simulations, wargaming the moment when fear would paralyze the public and governments, would do anything, literally anything, to prevent immediate collapse. When the lockdowns came, the plan rolled out with the precision of a military operation. Stock markets plummeted 34% in a single month, wiping out lifetimes of savings for teachers, nurses, factory workers, anyone who had dutifully followed the advice to invest in a 401k or an ISA. The Federal Reserve and the Bank of England responded within days, not with measured support for the real economy, but with a fire hose of newly created money aimed almost exclusively at the financial markets. $2 trillion in the United States, £750 billion in the United Kingdom. Numbers so large they sounded fictional, yet they were wired directly into the accounts of the already wealthy through corporate bond purchases, stock market backstops, and loan programs that somehow always found their way to the largest corporations first, while high street shops shuttered forever and families queued for food banks that had never existed before. The same governments handed Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, and a handful of private equity giants the cheapest capital in recorded history. Interest rates were slashed to zero, sometimes below zero, making it essentially free for those who already owned assets to borrow even more and buy everything that was suddenly on sale. Distressed real estate, crashed stock portfolios, failing competitors, all of it was scooped up at bankruptcy prices by the same funds that had been gifted trillions in fresh liquidity. BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, was quietly hired by the Federal Reserve itself to manage the very bailout program that would make BlackRock richer than most nations. In Britain, the Crown dependencies and the City of London became parking lots for billions in new, anonymous wealth, shielded behind the same offshore structures that had been built decades earlier for exactly this kind of moment. The mechanism was elegant in its cruelty. When a central bank buys corporate bonds or mortgage-backed securities, it does not drop cash into the pockets of ordinary citizens. It bids up the price of existing assets, houses, shares, commercial property, things that are overwhelmingly owned by the top 10%. Every pound or dollar printed in 2020 therefore flowed upward first, inflating the portfolios of the rich before a single penny reached the real economy. By the time furlough schemes and stimulus checks arrived months later, the damage was already done. The price of everything people needed to survive had begun its relentless climb, while the price of everything the elite already owned had skyrocketed even faster. A young couple in Manchester who had saved for a deposit watch the same terraced house jump from £220,000 to £350,000 in 18 months. A nurse in Ohio who had finally paid off her student loans saw her rent increase by 40%, while her 401k still hadn't recovered to its pre-crash level. The gap was not a side effect. The gap was the feature. Behind the scenes, the architects of this transfer operated with a clarity that bordered on ruthless poetry. Internal memos from the largest private equity firms, later leaked to investigative journalists, celebrated 2020 as the greatest buying opportunity since the Second World War. One managing partner at Apollo Global. Management wrote to his investors that the pandemic had delivered a once-in-a-lifetime chance to purchase irreplaceable assets at discounts that would normally require a world war. Another memo from the Carlyle Group described the coming wave of small business bankruptcies as a historic consolidation event that would eliminate competition for decades. They were not guessing. They already knew, because the same governments that were begging Parliament and Congress for emergency powers had quietly guaranteed that the big would be protected, while the small were allowed to fail. In the United States alone, more than 400,000 small businesses closed forever, while the combined wealth of American billionaires rose by over $1 trillion in the first 9 months of the crisis. The most chilling part is how openly it was discussed among those who mattered. In April 2020, while bodies were still being stored in refrigerated trucks outside New York hospitals, the former Bank of England, Governor Mark Carney gave a private webinar to institutional investors in which he described the coming inflation as a necessary repricing of assets that would benefit owners of real wealth. He did not mention the millions who owned nothing. In a closed-door session at the Aspen Institute that summer, Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, told his fellow billionaires that the pandemic represented the final stage of a 40-year transition toward a world where capital, not labor, would determine outcomes. The audience applauded. They understood that the old social contract, the one that had promised a fair shot in exchange for hard work, was being quietly retired, and that the pandemic had provided the perfect cover to finish the job. By 2023, the numbers were no longer deniable. The bottom 50% of Americans owned less than 1% of total stock market wealth, a smaller share than at any time since such records began. In Britain, the Resolution Foundation calculated that the pandemic had set working class living standards back by an entire decade, while the top 1% captured 90% of all new wealth created since 2020. Food bank usage in the United Kingdom hit record highs at the exact same moment that the Sunday Times Rich List recorded its largest single-year jump ever. In the United States, tent encampments spread across Los Angeles and San Francisco, while the Hamptons real estate market ran out of available mansions priced below $20 million. The two worlds no longer even pretended to occupy the same country. And then came the final twist, the one that turned a heist into a hostage situation. All that new money sloshing around the top of the economy had to go somewhere, so it poured into housing, into commodities, into everyday necessities. Rents, groceries, petrol, used cars, everything ordinary families buy with wages that did not rise in real terms for an entire generation. The inflation that central bankers swore was transitory arrived right on schedule, but it was never randomly distributed. It was a targeted tax on everyone who spends most of their income just to live. The wealthy, whose fortunes are tied to assets, watched their net worth soar with every percentage point increase in prices. The rest watched their purchasing power evaporate overnight. By 2025, the average British household was spending 54% of its disposable income on housing alone, a level not seen since the Victorian era. In America, 30-year mortgage rates that had been under 3% in 2020 now hovered near 8%, locking an entire generation out of home ownership for good. This is the moment historians will one day point to and wonder how we missed it. While we argued about masks and vaccines, about lockdown tiers and reopening dates, the largest redistribution of wealth in human history was completed in broad daylight. No tanks rolled through the streets. No revolutionary councils seized the banks. The transfer happened through spreadsheets and emergency legislation, through central bank press releases and carefully worded Treasury announcements that no normal person had time to read. The victims were too busy trying to keep their families safe to notice that the game had already been decided. And when the dust finally settled in 2025, the ownership class emerged, holding a larger share of global wealth than at any time since the eve of the French Revolution. The story is not finished. The anger is only beginning to form. Across America and Britain, young people who followed every rule, studied hard, took the debt, worked the extra jobs, are waking up to the realization that the ladder has been pulled away forever. They are inheriting a world where assets are owned by fewer hands than at any time in living memory, where wages buy less than they did when their parents were children, where the promise of upward mobility has been exposed as the longest-running bait and switch in economic history. The architects of the transfer believe they have won permanently, that the public will remain too divided, too exhausted, too distracted to ever demand reckoning. But history has a habit of surprising those who mistake silence for consent. The greatest wealth transfer of our age may have been executed in the shadow of a pandemic, but its consequences are only now beginning to break into the light. And when a generation finally understands what was taken from them while they were told simply to stay home and save grandma, the question will no longer be how it happened. The question will be what they intend to do about it.